The wind cut across the desert like a living thing, sharp enough to steal breath and thought alike. Dust rose in pale spirals, blinding and restless, scraping against a lone rider who pushed forward as if stubbornness alone could keep him upright. Far above, clouds gathered in heavy layers, bruised purple and gray, pressing low over a land that had seen too much blood to care for another man's fate. Ethan Cole rode with his head down. The horse beneath him was lean and tired, its flanks dark with sweat, its breath coming out in short bursts that fogged briefly before vanishing into the dry air. Ethan felt every jolt through his spine, every uneven stone through the soles of his boots. Pain lived in him now, permanent and quiet, like a scar that no longer bled, but never let him forget it was there. He told himself this was just another job. A folded paper lay inside his coat, creased and softened by days of travel. A debt notice, 3 months overdue. Numbers written in a clean hand that didn't care who had to suffer to make them balance. Ethan had collected dozens like this since the war ended. Ranchers, traders, widows who stared at him with hollow eyes. He never asked questions. Questions led to hesitation, and hesitation got men killed. The frontier rewarded movement. So he kept moving. The land opened wide as he crested a low ridge, revealing a shallow valley cut by a dry creek bed. Cottonwood trees clung to life along its edges, their leaves trembling as the wind slid through them like whispered warnings. Smoke rose in a thin, uncertain line from below, not the steady column of a town or post, but the fragile sign of a small camp, temporary and vulnerable. Ethan slowed his horse. Something was wrong. He scanned the valley carefully. No fences, no wagons, no sign of the trading post he had been told to expect. Instead, he saw blackened earth and broken poles scattered farther back, half buried by sand. The remains of a village, burned and abandoned. The kind of place men rode past quickly, pretending not to see. His jaw tightened. He guided his horse down the slope, every sense awake now. He dismounted before reaching the creek bed, leading the animal by the reins. His hand stayed close to his revolver, not gripping it, just resting there. A habit learned in places where a single wrong movement could mean the end. The smell reached him first, sage crushed underfoot, old smoke and ash carried on the wind. Then he saw her. She stood near the edge of the dry creek, framed by cottonwood shadows. Her dress was simple and worn, torn at one sleeve, the fabric darkened with dust and old stains. Her hair was braided tightly down her back, not for beauty, but for survival. She held no weapon that he could see. She didn't flinch when he stepped into view. She just watched him. Her face was still, but not empty. Grief lived there, deep and settled, like the land after a fire. Her eyes were dark and steady, reflecting neither fear nor welcome, only awareness. Ethan had faced gunmen, soldiers, men with nothing left to lose. But something about her gaze rooted him in place. He stopped several paces away and lifted his chin slightly in respect. "I'm looking for swift water," he said. His voice sounded rough, swallowed by the open space. The woman answered in Apache, her words low and even. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning carried beneath it. She gestured with one hand, not sharply, not accusingly, toward the burned village. Then she pointed to the ground between them. Then, briefly, to his chest. Ethan swallowed. Before he could respond, the wind shifted hard, snapping branches and sending leaves spinning. A distant rumble rolled through the valley, not thunder, hooves. Ethan turned instinctively, already knowing what he would see. Men emerged from the scrub along the ridge. 5 of them, rifles in hand, coats dusty, hats pulled low, faces tight with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. They spread out as they descended, practiced and careless all at once. Bounty hunters. Ethan felt the familiar cold settle in his gut. He recognized one of them, a tall man with a crooked grin and a red scarf at his throat. A man who wore a badge when it suited him and lost it just as easily. "Well, I'll be damned," the man called out. "If it isn't the debt collector." Ethan raised his hands slowly, keeping his body angled between the men and the woman without making it obvious. "This doesn't concern you," he said. The man laughed, sharp and ugly. "Everything out here concerns us, especially when there's a reward." One of the others glanced at the woman, his eyes lingering too long. "Looks like we got ourselves a bonus." The woman didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Ethan now, searching, weighing. The first shot cracked the air without warning. It hit the dirt near Ethan's feet, sending sand spraying. His horse reared and screamed, wrenching the reins from his hand and bolting toward the trees. Ethan dropped low, rolling behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the cottonwood leaves above him. The sound was deafening in the open valley, rifle fire echoing off stone and sky. He drew his revolver and fired twice, not to kill, but to push them back. One man yelped and stumbled. The woman moved then, not in panic. In purpose, she slipped into the trees, silent as breath, disappearing where Ethan's eyes could not follow. For a moment, fear sparked in him, not for himself, but for her. Then another sound cut through the chaos. A sharp cry, a rifle clattering to the ground. The hunters faltered. Ethan seized the moment. He broke from cover, sprinting low across the creek bed, dust and smoke burning his lungs. He tackled one man from behind, knocking the rifle aside. They rolled hard, fists and elbows, the man's breath hot and sour. Ethan struck once, twice, then shoved him away and didn't look back. Thunder finally broke overhead, loud and close. Rain fell suddenly, heavy drops turning dust to mud in seconds. The valley dissolved into confusion, shouts, slipping boots, the roar of water filling the dry creek like a resurrected beast. When it was over, two men lay groaning, one clutching his arm, another bleeding from the scalp. The rest fled up the ridge, vanishing into the storm. Ethan stood in the rain, chest heaving, revolver hanging loose at his side. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he had tried to outrun. The woman stepped back into view. Rain streaked her face, cutting clean lines through dust and ash. She looked at the injured men, then at Ethan. She said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked toward the cottonwoods, pausing only once to glance back and make sure he followed. Ethan hesitated. Then he did. They took shelter beneath a rocky overhang as night fell hard and fast. The storm raged outside, water pouring down in sheets. The desert transformed into something wild and alive. Ethan sat with his back against stone, revolver resting in his lap, eyes half-lidded but alert. The woman knelt across from him, tending to a small fire shielded by rocks. Her movements were efficient, practiced. When she finished, she looked up at him and spoke softly. One word he didn't understand, but he felt it settle between them like a truce. Ethan stared into the fire. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone with his ghosts. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the echoes of a world that was breaking and remaking itself all at once. And somewhere between the rain and the firelight, destiny took its first quiet step toward him. Morning came without kindness. The storm had moved on in the night, leaving the valley soaked and reshaped. The dry creek was no longer dry. Water slid over stone in a low, restless rush, carrying branches, ash, and the memories of fire downstream. Mist clung to the ground, softening the edges of the world, turning distance into something uncertain and fragile. Ethan woke to the sound of movement. He reached for his revolver before his eyes were fully open, then stopped. The woman stood near the fire pit, her back to him, feeding the last embers with careful hands. Smoke curled upward, thin and pale against the gray sky. She moved like someone who had learned to be quiet not out of fear, but necessity. He sat up slowly, muscles protesting. His coat was stiff with dried rain. He rolled his shoulders, wincing, and watched her for a moment, unsure of his place now that the danger had passed. She turned and met his gaze. There was no hostility in her eyes, no gratitude either, just acknowledgement. She pointed toward the valley, then made a small motion with her hand, as if tracing a path. Ethan understood enough. Move. Don't stay. They left the shelter together, keeping distance but moving in the same direction. Ethan found his horse downstream, tangled in brush but alive. He freed the reins and murmured softly, the animal trembling beneath his touch. The woman watched, head tilted slightly, as if cataloging another piece of him. They walked for hours. The land changed as they moved. Open sand giving way to scrub and stone, then narrow passes where the wind funneled hard and cold. Clouds still hung low, threatening more rain. Hunger gnawed at Ethan's stomach, but he ignored it. He had learned how far a man could go on empty. Near midday, they reached the remains of a homestead. Burned timbers leaned at broken angles, and a collapsed roof lay half sunk into the mud. The woman stopped there, her shoulders stiffening. She knelt beside a scorched post and pressed her palm against it, eyes closed. Ethan stood back. He felt like an intruder in a sacred place, one built not of walls but of memory. The silence stretched. When she finally rose, her face was unreadable, but something had hardened in her gaze. She spoke then, slowly, as if choosing words that might cross the distance between them. Ayana. She touched her chest once. Ethan nodded. Ethan. Names settled into the air, fragile but real. They found shelter beneath what remained of the roof. Ethan shared dried meat from his pack. Ayana accepted it with a nod, breaking it carefully and eating only what she needed. When he offered water, she hesitated, then drank, eyes never leaving his face. Trust, Ethan realized, was not given. It was measured. The afternoon wore on, heavy and close. Flies buzzed. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, thin and lonely. Ethan felt the weight of his purpose pressing against his ribs. The folded paper in his coat seemed to burn. He took it out at last and smoothed it on a flat stone that Ayana's eyes dropped to it. She didn't reach for it. She didn't ask. She looked at him instead, and something in her expression made his throat tighten. It's why I came, he said quietly. He tapped the paper once. Payment. She listened. When he finished, she knelt and drew a line in the dirt with her finger, then another crossing it. She spoke in Apache, voice steady but low, and pointed toward the mountains rising dark in the distance. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he understood the message. What was owed could not be separated from what had been taken. That night, the fire burned low. The stars came out sharp and cold. Ethan lay awake, staring at the sky, his thoughts circling places he'd buried. He saw the war again, mud, screams, the moment he'd left a friend bleeding because he'd been ordered to advance. He clenched his jaw until his teeth ached. Ayana sat across the fire, braiding and unbraiding a loose strand of her hair. She watched him with the same quiet attention she'd shown all day. After a long time, she rose and crossed the space between them. She crouched, then placed something in his open palm, a small carved figure, worn smooth by years of touch. Ethan looked at it, then at her. For the dead, she said softly in broken English. The words struck deeper than any bullet. The next days blurred together. They traveled along hidden paths, avoiding open ground. Twice, Ethan spotted riders in the distance and pulled them both into cover. Once, they went without food for a full day, drinking only what rainwater they could catch in folded cloth. Ayana taught him signs. When birds fell silent, when stones shifted unnaturally, when the wind carried the wrong scent. Ethan learned quickly. Survival was a language he already spoke. On the fourth evening, they reached a canyon where red stone walls rose like scars against the sky. Smoke drifted faintly from within. Ayana stopped. Her breath caught. She pressed her fist to her chest, then gestured toward Ethan and shook her head. Staby watched as she disappeared into the canyon. Time stretched thin. Ethan crouched behind a boulder, revolver drawn, every nerve on edge. Voices echoed faintly from within. Men laughing, the clink of metal. He saw them then, two of the hunters from the valley, camped at the canyon mouth. One held a bottle, the other a knife he used to clean his nails. Rage surged hot and fast. Before Ethan could act, a scream cut the air. He ran. The canyon exploded into chaos. One man went down hard, a rock smashing into his skull. The other turned, Too slow. Ethan tackled him, the knife skittering away. They fought in the dust, fists and breath and blood. Ethan struck until the man went limp. He found Ayanna near the back of the canyon, crouched beside a fallen elder. The old man's eyes were open, unseeing. Blood darkened the stone beneath him. Ayanna made a sound Ethan had never heard before, a broken, wordless cry that tore from her chest. Ethan stood helpless, the weight of his past crashing into the present. All the debts he collected, all the lives reduced to paper and INK. As the firelight flickered against the canyon walls, Ethan realized something had shifted. This was no longer about payment, that it was about choice. Dawn crept into the canyon like a cautious witness, pale light touching stone and skin with equal reluctance. Smoke from the dying fire drifted upward, carrying with it the sharp scent of blood and sage. Ethan sat with his back against the canyon wall, knees drawn up, hands resting uselessly in his lap. He had not slept. Sleep felt like a betrayal. Ayanna knelt beside the elder's body, her movements slow and deliberate. She washed the blood from his hands, wrapped him in a worn blanket, and placed a small bundle of herbs at his chest. She did not cry now. Her grief had gone quiet, sinking deep where it could do its work unseen. When she finished, she stood and faced the rising sun. She closed her eyes and lifted her chin, letting the light fall across her face. Ethan watched from a distance, aware that this moment did not belong to him, yet knowing he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. They buried the elder beneath a cottonwood at the canyon's edge. Ethan dug with his hands when the shovel broke, fingers raw and bleeding, welcoming the pain as penance. When it was done, Ayanna placed the carved figure he had returned to her on the grave, then covered it with earth. She turned to Ethan. "You can go," she said. The words were simple, but they struck him harder than any blow. He looked past her toward the open land beyond the canyon, the road that would take him back to contracts and coin, to a life defined by distance and avoidance. He could leave. He had always left. Ethan shook his head. "I won't." She studied him for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw doubt, anger, and something else. Fear, perhaps, not of him, but of hope. They didn't have long to decide. The sound came first. Hooves, many of them, beating against the earth like a warning drum. Ethan turned, already moving, scanning the ridges. Dust rose in thick clouds to the west. More men than before. Organized, determined. The hunters had returned, with reinforcements. Ethan counted quickly. 8, maybe 9. Too many to outrun. Too many to fight head-on. Ayanna spoke fast, urgent. She pointed toward a narrow pass leading deeper into the canyon, then toward the cliffs above. Her plan was clear even without words. They moved. Ethan took the high ground, climbing fast despite the burn in his muscles. Ayanna vanished into the pass, her presence marked only by the brief flutter of fabric and the certainty that she would be where she needed to be. The first riders entered the canyon, shouting, rifles raised. Ethan waited until they were directly below him. He fired once. The echo thundered between the walls. A man screamed and fell from his horse, the animal bolting in terror. Chaos erupted. Ayanna struck from the shadows, stones raining down, a blade flashing once before disappearing again. The canyon became a trap. Dust, screams, gunfire ricocheting wildly. Ethan moved with a grim calm, every shot measured, every breath controlled. This was not the war he remembered. This was something else, that a choice, that a bullet grazed his arm, tearing fabric and skin. He grunted, but stayed on his feet. Below, one hunter dropped his rifle and ran. Another begged. Ethan didn't listen. He disarmed when he could, wounded when he had to. He killed only when there was no other way. When it ended, the canyon was quiet again. 3 men lay dead. The rest fled, leaving behind weapons, blood, and silence. Ethan sank to his knees, breath ragged. His arm throbbed. His vision swam. He felt Ayanna beside him before he saw her. She tore a strip from her dress and bound his wound with practiced hands. Her touch was firm, steady. "You stayed," she said. He met her gaze. "Ishus." They remained in the canyon until nightfall, burning what needed to be burned, burying what could be buried. Ethan tore the debt notice into pieces and fed it to the fire, watching the ink curl and vanish. There was no payment left to collect. Weeks passed. They traveled north, following paths known only to those who listened to the land. Ethan learned when to speak and when to be silent. He learned that strength did not always announce itself. Ayana learned that not all men measured worth in bullets and paper point one evening. They stopped near a high ridge overlooking endless plains. The sky burned red and gold as the sun sank low. Ayana stood beside Ethan, close enough that he could feel her warmth. She took his hand, not as a promise, as an invitation. Ethan looked out over the land that had nearly killed him, that had stripped him bare and left him remade. He thought of the man he had been when he first rode into the valley. Empty, running, convinced he had nothing left to give, he closed his fingers around hers. They rode together at dawn, not toward a destination marked on any map, but into a life shaped by choice, loss, and the quiet courage to stay. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever stood at the edge of who you were and who you might become, remember this. Destiny does not shout. It waits. And sometimes it asks only that you choose not to walk away.